I never imagined that a single sentence, a few words strung together with cold precision, could uproot the entire foundation of my life, could make me question everything I thought I knew about my family, about loyalty, about love. 52 years of my life had been spent building what I believed to be a solid, unshakable world. I had poured myself into raising my children, into honoring my father, into creating a family that was not just bound by blood, but by trust and shared memories. I had thought I understood the rules of this world, that I knew the limits of love and the depths of loyalty. But that day, I discovered that my understanding was nothing but a fragile illusion. We were gathered in the living room, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the hardwood floor, when my father, a man I had idolized, the man whose approval had shaped my entire life, said the words that I will carry with me forever. He looked at me not as a son, not as a man who had stood by him through the storms, but as if I were a stranger, an intruder in a life I had believed to share. His eyes, usually warm, patient, and full of a quiet authority, were cold, distant, and sharp, like shards of ice aimed straight at my chest. He said I was not family anymore, just like that. The words hung in the air, heavier than anything I had ever encountered, weighing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe, making the room feel smaller, tighter, suffocating. I could hear my own heart thudding loudly, like it was trying to escape my chest, each beat a reminder of how surreal this moment had become. My children were there, my daughter looking confused and worried, my son staring at the floor, unable to understand what had just happened, and I realized that we were all standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into a chasm that had suddenly opened beneath our feet. The trust, the years, the memories, all of it felt as though it had been swept away by a single gust of cold, cruel wind. How could the man I had respected all my life turn his face against me with such casual finality? How could he erase decades of shared moments as though they had never existed? It was not just the words themselves. It was the weight behind them, the almost perverse satisfaction in the way he spoke them, the subtle curl of his lip that told me he believed he was in the right, that he was justified in his cruelty. There was a quiet, sinister pride in the way he delivered his judgment, as if he were unmasking a truth I was too blind to see, as if he were handing me a sentence I could not appeal, could not fight against, and could not escape. I felt anger, yes, but it was laced with shock and a deep, sinking sadness that threatened to drown me. In that moment, something ignited inside me, a fire I had never known existed. It was a mixture of disbelief and determination, anger and clarity, confusion and resolve. I realized then that my father was hiding something, a secret so profound, so potentially destructive, that it could tear apart everything he claimed to hold dear. And I knew, with the cold certainty of someone standing at the edge of a precipice, that I could not turn away. I could not let him get away with this. Not after all the years, not after all the sacrifices, not after everything I had built and protected. I understood that the path ahead would not be easy. The journey to uncover the truth would be long, painstaking, and probably painful. It might shatter my illusions. It might bring heartache I could not yet imagine, and yet there was no other choice. I could either live as a man who pretends nothing happened, who swallows the injustice and moves on, or I could confront it, uncover it, and bring the truth into the light, no matter the cost. And in that living room, under the golden light of a sun that seemed too indifferent to notice the storm breaking inside me, I made a decision that would shape the rest of my life. I would expose what he had hidden, reveal the truths he had buried, and I would do it with a patience, precision, and persistence that he would never anticipate. That day, I realized that family was more than blood. It was honesty, integrity, and trust. And if he refused to honor those things, then I would take it upon myself to restore them. That day changed everything, and there was no going back. For the longest time, I believed I knew my father. I thought I understood the man who had shaped my life, the man whose words had always carried weight, whose presence alone could command respect and attention in any room he entered. In our small town, everyone spoke of him with admiration, sometimes awe. His handshake was more than just a greeting. It was a promise, a silent contract that whatever he said could be trusted without question. His word had always seemed unbreakable, as if it were carved into the very fabric of our family history. I admired him, sometimes feared him, but above all, I trusted him. And yet, over the years, a creeping unease began to settle in the corners of my mind. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like the slow drip of water that wears away stone over time. I noticed that family gatherings, which once had a warmth that filled the room, now carried a tension that I couldn't ignore. Conversations felt measured, forced even, as if there were invisible lines we were all careful not to cross. Jokes that used to flow freely were now met with awkward pauses. Some topics were never discussed, avoided entirely, as if mentioning them might awaken a sleeping storm. I could sense a hesitation in my father's eyes, a flicker of something he tried to hide, a shadow of a secret behind his usual composed demeanor. It started with small things, tiny fragments that seemed unimportant on their own, but together they began to form a pattern I could not ignore. An old photograph tucked into a drawer I had never seen, faces I didn't recognize, moments frozen in time that he never mentioned. A name dropped casually in conversation, a person I had never heard of, yet one that seemed to spark a fleeting but unmistakable look of recognition in him before he quickly masked it. I began to notice discrepancies in his stories, contradictions in the memories he shared, and inconsistencies in the way he talked about events that had once seemed so familiar. He was a private man, yes, but his secrecy now felt deliberate, calculated, and uncomfortable. Something was lurking beneath the polished surface, something he did not want me, or anyone else, to see. I could not ignore it. I tried at first, tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that my mind was reading too much into harmless eccentricities. But the feeling persisted, gnawed at me like a quiet ache in the back of my mind. Eventually, I realized that my curiosity was not just idle, it was a necessity. There had to be a reason why he had looked at me the way he did that afternoon, why his words had cut through my family like a blade. I knew that beneath that composed, authoritative exterior, he was hiding something that had the power to unravel everything we thought we knew about him, about ourselves, about the life we had built together. So I began observing him more closely, quietly, almost invisibly. I didn't confront him or ask questions that might alert him to my suspicions. Instead, I watched, I listened, I documented. I noted every phone call he would brush off with vague excuses, every letter he tucked away in drawers without explanation, every financial statement, account, or receipt that seemed to appear and disappear without discussion. I began to make my own records, discreetly taking note of what seemed normal on the surface but strange upon reflection. I knew in my gut that these small details were pieces of a puzzle that would reveal the truth. It became an obsession, though I did not think of it as such at first. I would lie awake at night replaying conversations, scrutinizing expressions, questioning memories I had long accepted as fact. Each discovery, no matter how small, brought with it a mixture of fear and anticipation, anger and excitement, as if I were standing on the edge of a revelation that could either destroy everything I loved or finally explain why my father had turned against me so completely. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that my father had constructed a life in parallel to the one I had always known. A life filled with hidden decisions, covert alliances, financial maneuvers, and personal secrets that he had carefully curated to remain invisible. The man who had taught me the value of integrity had spent decades concealing truths that, if revealed, would shake the very foundation of our family. And yet, despite the fear gnawing at my chest, I felt a strange clarity. The anger I carried, the pain from his words that day, now had a direction. It was no longer just hurt or confusion. It was a purpose. I needed to know everything to understand every hidden action, every suppressed memory, every secret he had tried so hard to bury. This quiet investigation, this slow peeling back of layers, was the first step in a journey I had never anticipated. I was no longer just a son trying to reconcile with a father I loved. I was a seeker of truth, a witness to a life built on lies, and I was prepared to follow the path wherever it led, even if it meant confronting the man I had revered, the man who had just told me I was not family. Every note I made, every observation I recorded, was a step closer to uncovering the reality that my father had so carefully hidden for decades. I knew then that ignorance was no longer an option. I had to see the truth, no matter how painful, no matter how devastating, because only in knowing could I hope to reclaim the life that had been stolen from me by lies and silence. It took me weeks to piece together the fragments of my father's secret life, weeks of quiet observation, careful note-taking, and sleepless nights spent replaying memories and conversations in my mind. Every detail I discovered at first seemed insignificant, almost trivial, a fleeting clue that could be dismissed if I wanted to preserve the illusion that everything in my life was normal. But I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that each small anomaly was part of a larger puzzle, a puzzle whose picture would be both shocking and heartbreaking once fully revealed. I felt like an archaeologist, carefully brushing away layers of dirt to uncover something buried deep, something that had been hidden for decades, something that was never meant to be found. It was on a quiet evening, the house nearly silent except for the distant hum of the air conditioning, that I stumbled upon my first real breakthrough. I had been in my father's study under the pretense of looking for some old family photographs, but my instincts told me there was more to discover here, more than the neatly stacked ledgers and polished shelves would suggest. My hand brushed against the back of a filing cabinet, and I noticed a small gap, a space where the light fell differently. Curious, I slid the cabinet aside and found a stack of papers hidden behind old financial files, letters yellowed with age, and folders that had long been forgotten. I knew the moment I touched them that they were not meant for my eyes. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the stamps foreign, the notations in the margins precise and almost clinical. But I couldn't stop myself from sifting through them, reading carefully, absorbing every word, every number, every subtle indication that this was a part of my father's life I had never seen. Investments in companies I had never heard of, properties hidden under names I did not recognize, financial agreements that spanned decades, and correspondence with people whose names had always been whispered behind closed doors. It was as if he had built an entire world parallel to the one he showed us, a world that existed quietly in the shadows, completely separate from our family, from the life I had always believed was honest and straightforward. As I dug deeper, a pattern began to emerge, one that was at once intricate and terrifying. My father had not only been managing finances and investments without telling anyone, but he had also cultivated relationships with people who operated in ways I could barely comprehend. There were letters hinting at alliances, negotiations that affected entire communities, and even subtle threats disguised as business correspondence. I felt a knot in my stomach, a mixture of awe and dread, as I realized the scale of what he had kept hidden. He had been living two lives, one carefully curated for his family, the other existing in secrecy, unknown and untouchable, and I had been completely blind to it. It became painfully clear why he had said the words that still haunted me, the words that cut me out of the family like I had never existed. His anger, his cruelty, his cold dismissal of me as a son and a family member were not just acts of malice, they were acts of desperation. He feared that if I discovered the truth, the carefully maintained facade he had spent decades constructing would crumble. Everything he had worked for, every secret he had buried, every quiet manipulation could be exposed in an instant. And in that fear, he lashed out, protecting not the family, not the love he claimed to hold dear, but the carefully constructed illusion of his own control and power. I felt a mixture of emotions, anger, betrayal, sorrow, and an almost manic determination. The knowledge I had uncovered was intoxicating, and yet it carried with it a weight I could not ignore. It was no longer a matter of curiosity, it had become a mission. I had to know everything, every hidden account, every clandestine relationship, every shadowed decision that had shaped not only his life but the lives of everyone he had touched, including mine. That night I stayed in the study long after the rest of the house had gone quiet. I spread the papers across the desk, aligning them in a timeline, connecting names and dates, reading each line over and over as if repetition could reveal more. And in that silence, in that solitude, I realized something crucial. My father's words about me not being family were a warning, a shield to keep me away from the truth. They were not about my worth or my place in the family. They were about the fragility of his empire of secrets and the lengths he would go to protect it. And so I made a silent vow, a promise whispered only to myself in that dimly lit room. I would uncover every hidden chapter of his life. I would follow the clues no matter how long it took, no matter how many walls he built to keep me out. The first clues had opened a door, and I could feel that once I stepped through it, there would be no turning back. Every secret he had buried, every deception he had crafted, would one day come to light, and I would be ready. The journey had begun, and I would not rest until I had unearthed the full truth. It started as a small confrontation, something I thought would be minor, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of what I had already discovered. I had noticed that an important document related to our inheritance was missing, a piece of paper that should have been in the safe, in its proper place among other family records. I had approached him cautiously, trying to frame my question in a way that sounded innocent, a simple inquiry from a son to a father. But what I expected to be a routine explanation turned into something far darker, far more revealing than I could have imagined. I asked him about the document, my voice steady even as my chest tightened and my hand shook slightly. He looked at me, and for a moment there was a pause, a stillness in the air that made the room feel smaller, tighter, suffocating almost. Then he laughed, but it wasn't the warm, familiar laugh of the man I had grown up with, the man whose humor could light up a room and ease the tension in the air. This laugh was cold, calculated, deliberate. It carried with it a weight that was both mocking and chilling, as if he were amused not by the question itself, but by my naivety, my assumption that I could ever grasp the full extent of his world. And then he said the words, the ones that I will never forget for as long as I live. He said, with a calmness that made it all the more terrifying, that the family I had believed in, the family I had devoted myself to, had never truly existed in his eyes. That every gesture of care, every moment of trust, every memory I had cherished, had been insignificant compared to what he valued more, something he had protected and nurtured with a single-minded devotion, something that I would never be allowed to touch or understand. He made it clear that nothing I had done, nothing I could do, would ever change that fact, that my presence, my loyalty, and even my love were irrelevant to the world he had built and safeguarded. I left that room feeling the weight of betrayal settle over me like a storm. The man I had idolized, the figure who had once represented stability, honor, and guidance in my life, now felt like a stranger. I walked home with a mind swirling in chaos, my thoughts colliding and spinning, each one heavier than the last. I kept replaying his words over and over, dissecting them, searching for a crack, a hint, anything that might soften their impact, but there was none. He had stripped away the illusion I had clung to for decades, revealing a truth so cold and precise that it cut through me like a knife. And yet, as much as it hurt, as much as my heart felt shattered by the revelation, there was a strange clarity that emerged from the wreckage. The betrayal, raw and unexpected, illuminated something I had been blind to for years. I realized that this man, the father I had revered, was not the man I thought he was, and that recognition, painful as it was, had opened my eyes in a way nothing else could have. The old saying about trust but verify, which I had once considered merely practical advice, now rang truer than ever. Blind faith and unquestioning loyalty had no place in a life built on deception, and if I wanted to protect myself, my family, and my future, I needed to confront the truth, however bitter, however devastating. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the shadows of the room stretching long and distorted under the dim light, I made a quiet vow. I would not allow this betrayal to define me. I would not let it consume me entirely or leave me paralyzed by despair. Instead, I would use it as a guide, a compass pointing me toward the reality I needed to face. I understood in that moment of solitude and reflection that betrayal, though painful, could also be a gift. It had revealed what I could no longer ignore. It had shown me the contours of a secret world my father had hidden, and it had given me the determination to uncover it fully, piece by piece, until the entire truth was laid bare. I went to sleep that night not with a sense of peace, but with a resolute focus. The storm in my mind had not yet passed, but it had a direction now. The betrayal that had once felt like the end of everything had become, in a strange way, the beginning of something else, an awakening, a turning point, a moment where I could reclaim control over my life and confront the shadows my father had cast over it for far too long. After that final, chilling conversation with him, I understood something with a clarity that felt almost painful. Confronting him directly would be like stepping into a battle I was destined to lose. This was a man who had built his life on secrets, who treated manipulation like an art form and deception like a second language. He was sharp in ways that went beyond intelligence. He had the instinct of a predator, the ability to read people, predict their movements, and twist situations before anyone even realized what had happened. He was always 3 steps ahead, always shifting, always adapting. Facing him head-on would only give him the chance to bury me deeper in the lies he had already woven around all of us. So I knew I needed something far more calculated, something that required more patience, more restraint, and more emotional discipline than anything I had ever attempted in my life. I didn't build a plan in a day. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. Instead, it unfolded slowly, quietly, with small actions that seemed insignificant on the surface, but were essential pieces of a far greater puzzle. The first thing I did was gather what I already had, the scraps of information that I had ignored for years, because I trusted him too much to look closely. Old letters tucked away in drawers, bank statements from accounts I didn't recognize, contracts signed decades ago with people whose names I barely remembered, but whose roles suddenly seemed more important now. I began tracing patterns, amounts that didn't match our family records, dates that overlapped with events he had lied about, signatures that revealed deals nobody ever knew existed. But documents weren't enough. Paper only tells part of the story. People tell the rest. So I reached out to individuals who had crossed paths with him throughout his life, old employees, business partners, friends from his early years, even neighbors who had lived near us long before I understood the dynamics of our family. I didn't question them directly about him. Instead, I listened. I let them talk. Sometimes it was a small detail in their stories, a moment they didn't think twice about, a memory that felt harmless to them but crucial to me. Each conversation added another strand to the web I was beginning to map out. Over time, I created what I began calling in my mind the timeline of deceit. Not just a list of dates and numbers, but a detailed narrative that stretched across years. Years of calculated decisions, emotional manipulation, silent control, and hidden agendas. It wasn't only the financial side of things that shocked me. It was how deeply he had shaped the family's relationships with one another, how he had turned people into tools, how he had kept certain conflicts alive while extinguishing others, all to maintain his own power. I began to see that every argument, every sudden misunderstanding, every unexpected shift in loyalty within the family had been orchestrated, nudged, or influenced by him in some way. He didn't just control the money. He controlled the emotions, the atmosphere, the narrative we all believed. And as the picture became clearer, a strange sense of calm settled over me. Not peace exactly, but a quiet determination that hardened with each passing week. I knew this wouldn't be quick. I knew it could take months, maybe longer. But patience, which had once felt like passiveness, now became my strongest weapon. I used the silence to my advantage. I acted normal. I spoke to him the same way I always had, answered his questions, nodded when he spoke, creating no suspicion, giving him no hint that the foundation he stood on was slowly weakening beneath him. Every step I took, no matter how small, brought me closer to the moment when he would no longer be able to hide behind his confidence or his carefully curated facade. I imagined the day when the evidence would speak louder than any accusation I could ever make, when every document, every testimony, every contradiction would point directly at him, leaving him exposed not because I confronted him, but because his own actions had built the case against him piece by piece. I wanted him to feel the weight of it all, not through shouting, not through anger, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the silent and undeniable truth of what he had done. I wanted him to realize that the web he had spun for decades was unraveling, not because someone attacked it, but because someone finally understood it. That was my goal. That was the plan. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks stretched into months, the plan grew stronger, sharper, and ready for the moment when everything he had hidden would finally rise to the surface. I'd grown so used to working alone, to carrying the weight of this investigation on my own shoulders, that when the message arrived, it didn't even register as something important at first. It was late evening, the kind of quiet hour where the house feels too still, and every thought echoes louder than it should. I was sitting at the dining table with scattered papers in front of me, my eyes tired, my mind exhausted from trying to organize 1,000 scattered pieces of my father's hidden life. My phone buzzed once, a simple notification, but something about the name on the screen made me freeze. It was a woman I had heard about only in passing, someone my father had worked with almost a decade earlier before she, according to him, moved on to better things. I never questioned that story. I never questioned any of his stories back then. Her message was short, almost cautious, as if she wasn't sure whether she should be reaching out at all. She said she had been observing my father from a distance, that she had heard rumors of the recent conflict between us, and that she believed I needed to know the truth about who he really was. For a moment I simply stared at the words, unable to decide whether this was some kind of trap or the first ray of light cutting through years of darkness. But the tone wasn't threatening. It wasn't dramatic. It was tired. Tired in the way someone becomes after carrying a truth for too long, without being able to speak it aloud. I replied cautiously, asking her what she meant, and she responded almost immediately, telling me that she had worked closely with him for years, that she had seen things, heard things, experienced situations that still unsettled her when she remembered them. She said she knew he had enemies, but she also knew he was more dangerous to the people closest to him than to those who stood against him. The words hit me in a way I didn't expect. Hearing someone else describe him like that, someone who had no reason to hate him, no emotional history with him, felt like a punch straight to the center of everything I had been struggling to understand. We arranged to meet quietly, away from familiar places. I remember walking toward the cafe where she suggested we talk, my steps heavy, my mind racing with questions. When I saw her, she wasn't what I expected. She looked composed, successful, someone who had worked hard to build a new life far from the shadow of whatever had happened between her and my father. But her eyes held a guarded sadness, a weariness that only comes from years of being betrayed or manipulated by someone who should have been trustworthy. She didn't waste time with small talk. Before I even sat down, she told me that my father had once been a man she admired, someone she thought she could trust with her career, her ideas, even aspects of her personal life. But over time she began seeing patterns, the way he twisted narratives, how he undermined people who disagreed with him, how he played individuals against one another to maintain control. She told me about the subtle lies he crafted so effortlessly, the deals he made in secret, the money that flowed into places it shouldn't have, and the emotional manipulation that kept everyone around him unsure of themselves. Listening to her felt like hearing an echo of my own experiences, except she had recognized the darkness far earlier than I ever had. Then she opened her bag and placed it on the table. I expected a few papers, some old emails, maybe a letter, but what she revealed made my breath stop in my throat. There were documents, contracts, copies of financial statements, and even voice recordings collected over years. She told me she had kept them not out of spite, but because she always had a feeling that someday someone would need the truth. And today, she believed I was that someone. As she played one of the recordings, I heard my father's voice, calm, controlled, but dripping with a tone I had never noticed before, a tone that revealed the side of him he never showed the family. He was discussing deals, manipulating outcomes, speaking about people as if they were merely tools to be used and discarded. Hearing him like that made my skin crawl. It felt like watching a stranger wearing my father's face. She leaned closer and told me something that shook me even more. He always said the biggest threat would come from someone inside his own family, someone who knew too much without realizing it. Those words replayed in my head long after she said them, because they were the same words he had once hinted at during one of our heated conversations. It suddenly made sense why he had cut me off, why he had thrown me out with such cruelty. He saw me as a threat long before I even knew the truth he was hiding. For the first time in months, I felt something other than isolation. I felt supported, not in a loud, emotional way, but in a quiet and powerful sense of validation. This woman had no obligation to help me, no personal gain to expect. She had simply decided that the truth mattered more than her silence, and that act alone felt like someone placing a steady hand on my back while I walked through a storm. She warned me gently but firmly that my father would not accept defeat easily. He would fight back with everything he had: money, influence, manipulation, and the emotional power he had used for decades. She told me the path I was on would not be simple, and I needed to be prepared for consequences that might reach far beyond confrontation. But even with those warnings, the fear I felt was mixed with a growing sense of courage. Because for the first time, I wasn't standing alone against him. There was someone else who had seen the same darkness, someone who had endured it and lived to tell the truth. As I walked home that night with the documents tucked safely in my bag, I felt something shift inside me, a new kind of strength, a deeper determination. It was no longer just my fight. It was a fight for everyone he had deceived, everyone he had controlled, everyone whose lives he had shaped with lies. And the realization that someone else had suffered because of him, yet still chose to stand beside me, lit a fire I didn't know I had. I was not alone anymore. And that changed everything. I had known from the very beginning that this day would come, though I never allowed myself to imagine it in full. The confrontation had to be precise, calculated, and deliberate, because I wasn't dealing with a man who could be swayed by emotion, guilt, or reason. He was sharp, cunning, and had spent decades manipulating not only situations but the people around him. Any misstep could have allowed him to turn the situation back on me, to erase the months of careful work I had put into uncovering his secrets. So I prepared meticulously and planned every word, every action, every moment of this encounter, knowing that nothing less than absolute precision would bring the justice I sought. I invited him to my house under the guise of reconciliation. I portrayed myself as a son who wanted to heal, who wanted to restore a fractured relationship. I crafted my tone to be calm, inviting, even humble. I wanted him to walk in thinking he was in control, to believe that the day would unfold just as he always expected, with his authority unchallenged and his ego untouched. And like I had anticipated, he arrived with his usual air of superiority, straight-backed, chest out. The kind of man who believed that presence alone could command respect, that charisma and reputation were enough to mask any wrongdoing. He had no idea, not even a hint, that the evidence I had painstakingly gathered over months was now spread across the table before us, waiting, silent but undeniable. I asked him to sit, keeping my voice calm, steady, and almost neutral as if nothing extraordinary were happening. And then I began. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I didn't allow anger to show, even though my chest was tight with emotion, even though the years of betrayal and manipulation screamed inside me. I started slowly, presenting the first pieces of evidence, the letters, the hidden financial statements, the contracts signed in secret, the recordings, the testimonies from people who had been silenced for decades. I spoke clearly, methodically, giving context to each piece of information, connecting the dots that led to the undeniable picture of deceit he had woven over a lifetime. At first his face didn't change. There was a flicker of mild surprise, a twitch of curiosity, but mostly he looked as he always had, confident, self-assured, untouchable. I continued, revealing details he could not dismiss, patterns he could not deny, layers of deception so carefully documented that even he could see their weight. As the evidence mounted, I watched the transformation in him. Arrogance gave way to confusion. Confidence began to waver, and finally, in the moment when the full scope of his secrets became undeniable, shock settled on his features like a physical weight. His sharp eyes, which had once pierced through me so effortlessly, now darted nervously, searching for escape, for an explanation, for a way to twist the truth in his favor, but there was none to be found. He tried, of course. He tried to justify his actions, to explain away the secrecy, to make it seem as though his manipulations had been necessary, that they had served some higher purpose I could not comprehend. But I did not falter. I did not argue. I simply presented the facts, laid out clearly and calmly, letting them speak for themselves. The words were no longer mine. They were the echoes of his own choices, the tangible consequences of his actions, and he could not twist them into anything but the truth he had desperately tried to hide. That moment I realized something profound. The man who had once made me feel small, insignificant, powerless within my own family was suddenly diminished before my eyes. The power he had clung to for so long, the invisible grip he had maintained over the family, over our lives, over my perception of reality, was gone. It did not feel like revenge. It did not feel like satisfaction in the traditional sense. It felt like justice, measured, deliberate, and inevitable. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice or revel in his downfall. I simply let the truth stand in the room, undeniable, sharp, and inescapable. For the first time in decades, he was forced to confront himself, not as a father, not as a patriarch, not as a man of authority, but as a man whose life had been defined by deception. I saw fear and disbelief flicker across his face, subtle yet unmistakable. He had never been unprepared, never been caught off guard, and yet here he was, silent, exposed, unable to deny the reality of his own actions. The documents, the timeline, the corroborated accounts, all of it converged into a single, undeniable reality. The family he had claimed to protect, the family he had claimed to love, had been deceived at every turn, and he could no longer mask it. And in that silence, heavy and charged with the weight of decades of lies, I understood something I had not before. Power is not always loud. Authority is not always visible. Influence is not always overt, but truth is undeniable. Truth has a presence that cannot be argued with, cannot be denied, and cannot be destroyed. I did not raise my hand, did not shout, did not demand anything from him. I simply presented reality, and it was enough. The man who had once ruled my world now sat facing the consequences of his own life choices, and I finally understood the full meaning of the phrase. What is hidden in the dark will always come to light, and when it does, no amount of cunning, pride, or control can stop it. The days after the confrontation were nothing short of chaotic, but in a way that carried an almost cleansing weight. The air around our family shifted, charged with tension, raw emotion, and a sense of liberation that I hadn't expected. Those who had lived under the shadow of my father's control, who had trusted him blindly or feared him silently, were now forced to confront the reality he had constructed, and the reaction was unlike anything I had seen before. Some were angry, furious at the years of deception, at the manipulation that had shaped their decisions and emotions without their knowledge. Others were relieved, a weight lifted from their shoulders, as if they had finally been released from an invisible prison that had held them captive for decades. It was strange to witness. People I had known all my life were suddenly looking at my father with new eyes. Some confronted him openly, demanding explanations that he struggled to provide, fumbling for answers that could no longer repair the damage. Others chose distance, retreating silently as if the only way to protect themselves was to step away from the man who had defined so much of their lives. The very presence he had once wielded as power now worked against him. Authority, once unquestioned, crumbled under the weight of his own actions, leaving a man who was forced to reckon not just with the truth of what he had done, but with the reality of what he had lost. For me, the experience was different. I did not feel the rush of triumph that some might expect in a story of exposure and revelation. Instead, there was a quiet, almost surreal sense of peace, the kind that comes from watching a long-buried truth finally see the light of day. The months of preparation, the careful gathering of evidence, the planning and patience, all culminated in a moment where the deception that had loomed over my life was dismantled not by force, not by anger, but by clarity and truth. I could see finally that exposing him was not about punishment in the traditional sense. It was about illumination. It was about showing, not telling. And in that showing, in that unflinching confrontation with reality, there was a liberation that no words could capture. He tried, in the weeks that followed, to rebuild what had been broken. He reached out to family members, attempting explanations, offering apologies that rang hollow to the ears of those he had deceived. He tried to weave himself back into the lives of the people he had hurt, attempting to reclaim the influence that had been stripped from him in that one calm but irrevocable presentation of evidence. But trust once shattered cannot be forced, and control once lost cannot be regained by a simple gesture or a carefully chosen word. Every attempt he made was met with hesitation, skepticism, and in some cases, outright refusal. His efforts were reminders not of the power he still held, but of the consequences of the life he had chosen to live in secrecy. Watching him navigate the fallout was a revelation in itself. I had once feared him, once felt the weight of his presence pressing down on every choice I made, every relationship I nurtured. But now, observing him wrestle with the impact of his actions, I realized that the true power in life does not lie in secrecy, control, or manipulation. It lies in honesty, in transparency, and in the courage to face the consequences of one's own choices. I did not need to gloat, did not need to celebrate, because the truth was already doing all the work. The man who had controlled our family, who had dictated the terms of loyalty and obedience, was now at the mercy of the reality he had created. And that, in itself, was a victory beyond any satisfaction I could have imagined. Even as chaos swirled around us, as family dynamics shifted and relationships were renegotiated, I felt an unexpected calm. The air was lighter. Conversations were more genuine, if sometimes tense. The bonds that remained were forged not through fear, obligation, or manipulation, but through understanding, shared truth, and the realization that none of us could allow deception to define our lives again. The lessons of those weeks, of those months of planning and waiting, extended far beyond the confrontation itself. They were reminders that power without accountability is fragile, that control through deceit is unsustainable, and that truth, even when delayed, has an inevitability that cannot be denied. In that aftermath, I understood that exposure is not revenge in its simplest form. It is revelation. It is the act of showing what has long been hidden, of allowing reality to speak for itself, and letting consequences unfold naturally. Seeing my father face the undeniable results of his own choices, seeing the walls he had built around himself crumble under the weight of facts and truth, was more satisfying than any act of retribution I could have imagined. I felt lighter, stronger, and for the first time in years, completely free of the shadow he had cast over my life. And in that freedom, I knew that while the path had been painful, while the journey had been long and emotionally exhausting, the clarity, the honesty, and the courage to confront the truth were worth every moment. Looking back on everything, I realized that the anger I had carried for so long, the burning frustration and the bitter resentment that had seemed to define my days, was only one part of the journey. It had been a necessary part, yes, a raw, visceral response to betrayal and deception, but it was not the whole story. As the dust settled, as the chaos of the aftermath faded into something quieter, something reflective, I began to see the deeper layers of what had happened, the lessons hidden beneath the pain, and the truth that had emerged from the long and difficult process. The first lesson, I suppose, was about the power of truth. I had always believed, as most of us do, that the truth has a way of revealing itself naturally, that time alone would make everything clear. But living through this, witnessing the weight that secrets can carry, I understood that truth requires courage. It requires the willingness to seek it, to confront it, and sometimes to fight for it. It is not passive, it is active. It demands attention, patience, and an unwavering commitment to uncovering what has been buried, no matter how uncomfortable or threatening it may be. The journey to the truth is rarely neat, rarely easy, and often comes at a cost. Yet when it arrives, its presence is undeniable, illuminating corners of life that had been hidden in shadow, revealing not only the flaws of others but the resilience within ourselves. I also realized that betrayal by someone you love is unlike any other pain. It is a wound that cuts deeper, a fracture that shakes your understanding of loyalty, trust, and intimacy. It challenges your assumptions about who people are, about the promises they make, and the values they claim to hold. But it can also be a catalyst, a spark that ignites growth and self-discovery in ways that comfort never could. The devastation I felt when my father rejected me, when he placed his secrets above the family, was profound. And yet, that same devastation forced me to rise, to think critically, to act decisively, and ultimately to reclaim a part of my life that had been overshadowed by manipulation and control. Pain, I realized, can be a teacher if you allow yourself to listen, if you allow yourself to see beyond the immediate hurt. Another profound realization was about the true meaning of family. Family is often defined simply as blood, as lineage, as the people who share your DNA. But the experiences of these past months taught me that family is far more than that. Family is about respect, about honesty, about accountability, about building bonds that do not crumble under pressure or deceit. It is about nurturing relationships where trust is not assumed but earned, where care is expressed not through control but through understanding, and where every member is allowed to exist fully and truthfully. Exposing my father's secrets was not about triumphing over him or exacting revenge in the traditional sense. It was about reclaiming the dignity of our family, about restoring the foundation upon which future generations could build lives rooted in honesty and integrity. I also came to understand the subtle distinction between justice and revenge. For years, I had imagined that confronting him, revealing his lies and unmasking his manipulations would bring a sense of victory, a rush of satisfaction that would make the pain fade. But the truth was more profound, more nuanced. There was no gloating, no celebration. The satisfaction came from clarity, from understanding, from the simple, undeniable presence of truth standing firmly in the room where deception once ruled. Watching him face the consequences of his choices, witnessing the unraveling of the carefully maintained facade, was not about winning. It was about allowing reality to take its course, about seeing balance restored in a life long distorted by secrecy. In the quiet moments that followed, I reflected on my own growth. I had discovered patience I did not know I possessed, resilience that had been forged under pressure, and judgment sharpened by careful observation. I had learned to navigate complex emotions, to act with strategy instead of impulse, to pursue justice without losing my humanity. And perhaps most importantly, I had discovered that standing for truth, even when it threatens the most intimate bonds in your life, is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of courage, an assertion of your values and your integrity. As I thought about the future, I realized that the foundation I had helped restore in our family was fragile, but it was real. The lessons I had learned would not fade. The next generation, the children and grandchildren who would grow up in a world shaped by honesty rather than hidden agendas, would inherit a family where truth mattered more than appearances, where respect mattered more than fear, and where integrity mattered more than control. I felt a quiet pride in that, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with revenge or anger, and everything to do with life lived with eyes wide open, with courage, and with the willingness to face even the most painful truths. Ultimately, I understood that the journey through betrayal, secrecy, and deception is not simply about uncovering someone else's flaws. It is about discovering the strength within yourself, about seeing the difference between illusion and reality, about learning that courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to act despite it. My father's betrayal had been devastating, yes, but it had also been transformative. It had forced me to confront not just his choices, but mine, and it had given me the clarity to build a life, a family, and a legacy that no deception could ever undermine. In the end, I realized that truth is the greatest inheritance we can leave behind, far more valuable than wealth, far more lasting than reputation. Exposing his secrets was never about triumph over him. It was about reclaiming our dignity, preserving the integrity of the family, and setting a foundation that could not be shaken by lies or manipulation. And as I looked forward, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. A sense of peace, a quiet confidence that the future could be built on honesty, strength, and the unwavering belief that what is hidden in darkness will, in time, always come into the light. Now, as I look back on everything that has transpired, I see my life through a lens that is clearer, sharper, and more grounded than it ever was before. The chaos, the betrayal, the months of painstaking investigation and emotional turbulence have left their mark, but they have also shaped me in ways that no comfort or happiness ever could. I've rebuilt my family, not just in the sense of physical proximity or daily routines, but in the deeper, far more meaningful sense of trust, respect, and transparency. Conversations that were once fraught with tension are now open, honest, and filled with understanding. Relationships that had been strained, weakened by unspoken secrets and hidden agendas, have been restored on the foundation of truth, and there is a quiet strength in that foundation that feels unshakable. My father remains a part of my life, but our relationship has changed profoundly. It is no longer defined by blind loyalty, fear, or the unspoken weight of his authority. It is now framed by boundaries, mutual understanding, and an acceptance of the reality that some actions have consequences that cannot simply be erased. I have chosen to maintain connection, not out of obligation or lingering sentimentality, but because even in the wake of betrayal, relationships can be preserved if they are approached with honesty, respect, and a clear recognition of each person's place in the family's story. Our interactions are measured, intentional, and grounded in a shared recognition of the past, but they no longer compromise the values I hold dear. The man I once idolized is still present, but he no longer has the power to shape my life or dictate my family's future. That, I realize, is the truest measure of growth and resilience, when you reclaim your life not by destroying someone else, but by setting boundaries and insisting on integrity. The lesson I wish to leave with anyone who may hear or read this story is simple in words but profound in practice. Never be afraid to uncover the truth, even when it comes from someone you love, even when it threatens to fracture the world you thought you knew. The pain of betrayal is immense, crushing even, but it can also illuminate hidden strengths within yourself that you never imagined existed. It can awaken courage, patience, and strategic thinking. It can show you the difference between blind loyalty and wise discernment. In my case, the betrayal that cut so deeply also revealed resilience I didn't know I possessed, the ability to navigate treachery with calm focus, and the capacity to rebuild what had been broken without losing my sense of self. Protecting yourself with knowledge, gathering evidence patiently, and understanding the importance of timing became crucial lessons. I realized that justice does not always arrive in the form of punishment or revenge. Sometimes justice is subtler, quieter, and far more powerful. It lies in exposing reality, in letting truth stand unchallenged and undeniable, in allowing the consequences of deception to unfold naturally. The revelation of secrets, the exposure of lies, the clarity of fact over fiction, all of it becomes a form of justice, far more profound than any moment of vengeance could ever achieve. Watching the man who had wielded control over our family finally confronted by his own choices was a lesson in power, consequence, and the inevitability of truth. I've come to understand that life is not about letting betrayal define you or letting deception dictate the terms of your existence. It is about reclaiming your narrative, asserting your values, and walking forward with dignity and tact. Sometimes the most powerful form of revenge is not anger, not confrontation, not retaliation. It is simply revealing the truth and continuing your life with the strength and integrity you have earned. That was my path. That is my message. Truth has a way of setting the world right, even when it seems that everything is lost, even when darkness has clouded vision and hope feels distant. And now, with a family rebuilt on honesty, with relationships renewed through clarity and accountability, I move forward not with bitterness, not with grudges, but with the profound understanding that life is shaped not by those who betray us, but by how we respond to that betrayal. Each decision, each action, each moment of courage becomes a thread in the tapestry of our lives. And when woven with integrity, patience, and truth, it creates a story that is unshakable, resilient, and deeply human. I walk forward with peace in my heart, with clarity in my mind, and with the certainty that while deception can harm, concealment can confuse, and betrayal can wound, the power of truth, courage, and integrity is enduring. That is the legacy I choose to leave for my family, for myself, and for the generations who will come after us. And in the quiet knowledge of what has been uncovered, what has been rebuilt, and what has been endured, I understand fully that the most lasting, meaningful, and satisfying victory is not in the downfall of another, but in the strength, dignity, and honesty with which you face life, no matter the shadows that preceded it.